guest for us tonight. You are listening to Studio A. Excuse me, and my special guest this evening is Keith Hunter. And Keith specializes in decoding ancient myths to reveal advanced scientific knowledge of the past. He also studies ancient systems of measure and megalithic monuments and esoteric technology, both ancient and modern. His book is called Occult Physics, which will be released in the next couple of weeks from his website. It provides evidence that the Earth and the whole solar system was once in a state of exceptional harmony. It also demonstrates that various ancient megalithic monuments were positioned to be nodal points on an Earth energy grid matrix, and that certain modern military bases have been likewise positioned in accordance with the same ancient science of the past. His website is www.occultphysics.com. And please welcome Keith to the show this evening. Good evening, Keith, or good morning over there.
Yeah, it is. It's 5 in the morning over here. Yes, it's good to be here, though.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you on board with us this morning. So good morning to you over there, and I'm glad you're joining us, so thank you.
Yeah, so I don't know if we could get straight into it here. Basically, I think the main topics that people are very much interested in right now are the North Korean situation, and especially the potential threat, the nuclear threat. But, it does go further than that, because when you examine some of the things that have been going on lately with regards to some of the testing, it seems that certain tests that North Korea have been doing, not at their main nuclear test site, but out to sea, seem to indicate that they are testing some highly advanced weapon systems capable of generating artificially earthquakes. And then we've got this issue of the hurricanes lately that have been going and hitting the US, going through the Caribbean as well. And there's a real suggestion here that some of these may well be artificial, and there's some very interesting historical precedents that lead to that. So I think that what I'd initially say, just to go back on some of the things you mentioned in the introduction and where I came from research-wise, because it's like a circuitous route to go from looking into ancient myths to coming up with, looking at advanced scientific esoteric technology, you might call it. When I think initially I'd say 20 years ago, I've always been interested in like Greek mythology and things like that. And some of these ideas that the Earth once had an ideal orbit of 360 days and the moon had a 30-day month. And if you look at some of the ratios between the planets and the solar system in general, for example, the radius of the Earth, and then you look at the distance between the Earth and the moon, it's like a 1/60 ratio, but everything's just slightly off. Everything's just slightly shifted. So I thought that the solar system itself had shifted. But not only that, even the size of the Earth shifted. The Earth was physically smaller in the past. And so I started to not just look at orbital periods in the solar system, like the number of days per year, etc., but started to look at the Earth itself in terms of its size, what its ideal size was, and then look at measurement systems that we use. Like today we have British imperial measures and other competing systems, the metric system. So then I started to look at these, and I made some critical breakthroughs in what you might classify as discovering a kind of universal system of measures, and it is based upon British imperial measures. And so then I started to look at these measures and then look at megalithic monuments and things like Stonehenge, things like the Great Pyramid, which I think we can all admit are devices. So I started to look at these, and I found out that there are tie-ins towards critical, distances of separation, what we call great circle arc distances, from one megalithic monument to another. And they appear to, again, have set up certain special ratios to the very size of the Earth. And so when I started looking at these, that was very intriguing. There's an article on my website about the Great Pyramid in this regard. So then I started to look at other bases, like modern military bases, like some of the covert ones, like the Menwith Hill Signals Intelligence Base over in Britain, North Yorkshire. That's close to where I am. And then there's the Pine Gap Base in Australia. Again, this is a US base. It's like these are manned almost exclusively by US personnel. These are bases that have been set up in foreign friendly countries, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And you could see some of the special relations, and I'll just give you an example with regard to these two.
Okay.
You know, in the United States, your power grid has a frequency of 60 hertz, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to work out, you know, we've got the speed of light, 186,282 miles per hour or so, yeah. And if you take that and there's a formula which ties together speed of light, frequency, and wavelength. Because, you know, when we think about a peak to peak or trough to trough, a wave pattern, yes, and we model it. So for that frequency of 60 hertz, right, if you've got the speed of light, the accompanying wavelength with that is about 3,112 miles. It's a very long thing, yeah? So if you go into, say, Google Earth and you look at the Menwith Hill site, and you can zoom right in on it. I mean, it's a public base, you know, even though what goes on there is secret, where it is like, you know, it's on Google Earth, you know, everybody knows where it is. It's got the big, you know, golf ball things all around it, you know, with the radomes and the massive building complex. So it's like that. And you can go into look at the Menwith Hill location, you get the latitude and longitude, and then you can go to the Pine Gap base and get the latitude, longitude there. And if you work out, and again, you can use a Great Circle calculator. You work out the Great Circle arc distance connecting up both sites direct to one another. If you take that value there, what you'll find is that that value has a very special ratio to the very equator of the Earth itself. It's such that the equator of the Earth, the circular equatorial circumference of the Earth, divided by the Great Circle arc connecting Pine Gap and Menwith Hill, right, as a ratio of 8/3. And what that means is if you take the circumference of the Earth and divide it by the Great Circle arc of these two bases, you'll get something on your calculator that will look like 2.66666 recurring as a sequence, which is the fraction 8/3. And that means that if you take the circumference of the Earth and divide it by 8, and you take the Great Circle arc connecting the two bases and divide by 3, you'll get the same answer. And the answer in question is 3,112 miles, which is practically dead on the wavelength accompanying a 60 hertz power grid frequency. So you can see how they set up these bases and they do it with certain separation distances between them, which have special ratio connections to the Earth, which, you know, essentially you're resonating the Earth, you're agitating the Earth, you're using the Earth as a means to transmit power through it via these two bases. And one of the things at Pine Gap, one of the little things that came out, a snippet of information, when it was built, they built a large borehole of about 5.3 miles in depth. And this was, I think, some kind of on record as the largest or the deepest borehole that's been drilled so far. Although I think some people said that we're a 9-mile one in Russia, but that's by the by. I think that was an experiment just to see how far they could go. But this one is a kind of a smallish borehole, 5.3 miles deep. And when you consider what they were doing, it reminds you a lot of Nikola Tesla's work. Because when he did his Wardenclyffe Tower set up in 1901, he got some funding from JP Morgan, and he basically said, you know, he did the whole design. It's not just the tower. There's this massive substructure of about, I think in his case, he'd only got down 320 feet or whatever. And so you had these poles, these metal poles he had to connect and put into it like a shaft. And he literally said, Tesla, you know, his machine needs to like grab hold of the Earth and pump the Earth, some kind of physical action, which gives instantaneous, you know, transmission of energy essentially everywhere at all points on the Earth by pumping it at one site. So it's a kind of an electrical pump, and it draws diagrams to that effect. So when you look at what's going on at Pine Gap, it seems to be like an extension of what Tesla was doing then, only far more advanced. And the Pine Gap Treaty was signed to build this base in 1966. So, again, this is just one example. And you see, again, as I said, if you connect up various megalithic monuments, Great Circle arcs, to say Stonehenge to the Great Pyramid, or you look at the latitude displacement, that is the arc from the equator up to the latitude of a structure, you find that these are not random. They have special links to them. And so this was the first kind of thing that led me to think that, well, it seems that the modern physics that we're, coming up with here with our own bases, we're replicating this ancient science of the past with what they were doing there. But here was where things get really interesting from a standpoint of technology, because there was a researcher named Bruce Cathy.
Yeah, I remember him.
New Zealand researcher, and I've got a few of his books on my shelf. And he was looking at, at Earth energy grid patterns and that kind of thing with regards to UFO flight patterns. And on a bit of a hunch, he decided to do something which was quite radical. He basically decided to see if there was some sort of relationship between nuclear tests and where they were set up on the ground, say, and the position of the sun in the sky. Now, when we think about the sun in the sky, basically, if you just freeze the Earth in its rotation at any given moment and draw a straight line between the center of the sun to the center of the Earth, that line will pierce through the surface of the Earth. So you'll have a kind of ground-based coordinate, latitude, longitude, and then you'll have a ground-based coordinate for, say, where the bomb is on the Earth, right? So imagine where I was talking before, when I said you can get two different megalithic monuments or two different signals intelligence bases, and you'll find the Great Circle arc connecting both coordinates has special ratios tied to the Earth. Well, what he looked at was, he just on a bit of a hunch, he thought, well, I'll do the same thing. I've got two coordinates. One is for when a nuclear bomb goes off. Another one is for where the sun is mapped onto the ground. So he started to look at some of this stuff, and quite remarkably, he found that when these tests were done, when scientists were doing them, the arc lengths were not just random. They were really, really carefully chosen with split-second timing. Now, Cathy was working with an assumed spherical Earth model. And this is not a brilliant model. You've got to use a true Earth ellipsoid model. And I suppose it's very easy now, because he was doing a lot of his work initially in the 1960s when the modern, desktop computer, nobody had one really. Right. So it's so easy today to go online and just get a Great Circle calculator, and somebody's already pre-programmed it, so everything's great, and you can do calculations very easy. So Cathy was working with a model, assumed spherical model, I think for simplicity of being able to do his calculations. But when you look at the Great Circle models we've got now, we can do very accurate calculations. So what I did was, we've now got, again, a lot of declassified nuclear archives. So they give you, and they're very good at it. I mean, I've got them all for all the major countries, right from Trinity, the Trinity test, 16th of July, 1945, the US first did, right up until the 1990s, and well, even today, because we're going to be discussing North Korea. But we've got all these tests, and these countries, will give you the precise coordinates, latitude and longitude, as to where the device was set up, say, and they even tell you literally to the nearest second when the devices were triggered. Now, once you know the time, you can put that into an astronomy package, and you can work out very precisely the sun's ground position, its coordinates on the ground, like I described before. And then you can use a very accurate Great Circle calculator to work out the arc distances. And I started comparing the arc length measures of different tests to one another, even conducted years apart, especially the prominent ones. And I'll give you an example. the highest yield atmospheric test that the United States ever developed or set off was Shot Bravo. It was Castle Bravo, 1954. And it was a 15 megaton device. Very powerful. Mm-hmm. And if you look at another device that was done in 1952, part of the Ivy series, it was called King. And that was a free fall bomb drop. So you had a plane at a high altitude, drop the bomb free fall, and when it got to, I think it was 1,500 feet, just above ground, it was triggered then. Mm-hmm. So if you plug in the precise times of when each of these two devices was set off, and you've got the on-the-ground coordinates from the archives, and I use the US Naval Observatory's own software for this one, mm-hmm. and you work out the arc length, the Great Circle arc connecting the sun ground position to ground zero for, say, Castle Bravo, and you do the same for King, and you do a ratio, one divided by the other, you literally get 2.66666 recurring, which is that basic fraction 8/3, which coincidentally is the same one that you get with the connection between the Pine Gap and the Menwith Hill Base and the Earth. And wow. when you look at these ratios, and I really want to emphasize this point, they are like super accurate. There's like no doubt about it. Right. We see when we look at the Earth itself rotating on its axis, right? In 1 second of time, right? In 24 hours, there are 86,400 seconds. If you just take a point, say, on the equator of the Earth, where the sun is, and you just literally count 1 second, and the Earth rotates, that little point will shift about 1,500 feet in 1 second. When you compare these ratios for the Castle Bravo to the Ivy King devices, it's so accurate, mm-hmm. the ratio, that you need only adjust one of these lengths by just a few hundred feet, and it's a perfect fraction, which tells you that when they trigger these devices, they're doing with split-second timing. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the things Kathy noted. He said that whenever they were doing tests, they had like special observational posts set up monitoring the sun to be absolutely certain of the timing. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at a variety of nuclear tests, you find that their arc length measures are all basic fractions of one another, like musical fractions. And they even have ratio tines to the dimensions of the Earth, especially the equator of the Earth. And my theory on this as to why they do this, I might as well just give you the basics. I mean, my theory, because it has changed over time, but when you design a nuclear weapon, you will have a design yield, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of megatons, yeah? Amount of energy that you'll realize in an explosion. Right. And so what I think is going on is this. If you take your device and you were to, say, set it off at any random place on the Earth at any random time in an idealized way, you'll get your design yield. But if you say to yourself, well, I'm going to set it off when the Great Circle arc connecting the device to the sun is such that it is a basic fraction of the equator of the Earth, maybe 1/6. I'm going to do something special like that. If you do something like that, you've got the ability to boost the yield of the device, because these devices don't just work on the power of the inherent to the device. They like draw in celestial energy. Mm-hmm. They're like resonance-based devices. Flowing over the Earth are a multitude of subtle wave patterns, and when you trigger your device at the right time, right location, you basically are looking at a kind of harmonic convergence of these wave patterns relative to your device, so that you tap into extra energy. So you can boost the yield of your device multiple times if you know the right combinations. But I would also suggest, because of some of the work I've done on earthquake forecasting and some of the esoteric secrets of that, you can also dampen the nuclear yield. You know, there are certain combinations, and it's not just with regards to the sun, but even the moon and the other planets. Certain configurations can cause the design yields to be weakened. So a lot of the nuclear testing that's been done, pretty much all of it, has been done to try to work out how the design yield is modified by literally the positions of the sun and the moon and the planets when they trigger these devices. And this is one of the interesting things about Bravo. Bravo, this 15 megaton device, it was actually thought that its yield would only be round about 6 megatons, something like that. And it was like boosted about 2.5 times. And this was unexpected. I mean, it nearly killed all the American observers because the blast was so powerful. It nearly overturned ships and wiped out the people on the other side of the island. I think it was Eniwetok Atoll. So it was really powerful. And so they boosted the device because the frequency combinations that they'd chosen, the arc lengths, were more powerful than they'd anticipated. So that was the kind of thing going off. So this leads you to, when you start to look at nuclear devices and nuclear tests, when you realize that they want to try to ensure that their device has a really high energy, it then becomes possible to say, you know, if somebody's going to do a nuclear test, we might be able to forecast when they're going to do it, okay, by kind of getting it, you know, having an evaluation of where, say, the sun is, if they're working on the sun, and looking at, we know where their test site is, and we can say, you know, maybe they're going to do their tests at a certain time, when there's a certain separation between the sun and the test site itself. And one of the things that Cathy did was exactly that. About, I think it was 3 weeks in advance, in 1968, the French were doing some testing in the one of their test sites in the southern hemisphere. I think it was Muraro Atoll or something like that, about 20 degrees latitude south. And basically, 3 weeks in advance, he was looking at sun tables, and he correctly forecast, I believe it was September the 8th, 1968. He got the day, and I think it was only about a couple of hours out. I think it was about 4 hours out, just under 4 hours, as to when they trigger this device. And it wasn't because he had a crystal ball or he got some leaked intel. It was literally because he was looking at the sun tables and he thought, I think I know what arc length combination that they're going to test here. So he was able to work it out. And it's an astounding thing to think that you can forecast when and where somebody's going to maybe, well, if you know the where, you can examine the when issue, when they're going to trigger it. So when North Korea, you see, this is the thing about a lot of tests right now. The US testing program officially stopped in, I think it was 1992, something like that. But some of the countries have still gone on to do tests, and there are also secret testing programs developing exotic nuclear weapons explosions, which I'm going to get into in a moment. But with North Korea, they've done, they first did their first test in 2006, and they've done to date, including the one that they've just done, I think was it the 3rd of September, they've done 6 in all. And the first test that they did was, you see, one of the things that we can do to work out the yields is we look at the seismic signature, because these are underground tests, and we can, with monitoring stations around the world, we can determine from the seismic signatures, like the Richter scale values, we can use special formulas to work out the actual yields of the values themselves. So I'll actually just tell you, for the first test that they did, 2006, the yield was only 1,000 tons of TNT. Not that brilliant, yeah? And just for comparison, the device dropped on Hiroshima was 15,000 tons. So their first test was only about 1,000. But then they did one last year, 9th of September 2016, and this was a significant one. This gave a 5.3 energy signature, and the yield there was 11,662. Yeah, 11.6. So you think about that, 15,000 Hiroshima, and they've got about 11,500. So it's comparable there, right? So everybody's like, going a bit nuts, thinking, are they going to do another test? And that Kim Jong-un is bragging, we've got hydrogen bombs. Oh, we've scaled it up amazingly. And so just at least from what they'd done with the first 5 tests, we'd got this yield of about 11.5 kilotons. So what they did then, and this is the one that we've just seen happen, this was on the 3rd of September, and this particular test gave a seismic signature of 6.3. And I mean, these values I'm reading out, I actually use the formulas. I've used the exact formulas that the UN people used when they were investigating North Korea's tests. So these values are very precise based on the formulas for conversions of seismic signature to nuclear yield. So this 6.31, the actual yield is 124,000 tons of TNT. So Hiroshima, as I say, 15,000. So this is about 8.3 times more powerful than Hiroshima.
Wow.
So it is a significant one. Now, in terms of hydrogen bomb versus what we call just a basic atom bomb, basic atom bombs originally, they were based upon pure fission. What that means is you will have a fissile material like uranium-235 or plutonium-239, and you split them, because these are like big atoms. These are very dense metals, and you split these atoms to release energy. A fusion reaction is where you take really light elements like hydrogen isotopes like deuterium or tritium, and you fuse these together, and this is what releases energy. Now, the fusion reactions can produce energy releases vastly greater than pure fission ones. And so this is why when he's saying, I've got hydrogen bombs, he's basically saying, hey, we've scaled up from these basic atom bombs. The highest yield pure fission device the US ever tested was King. And that was the one I was just mentioning previously, the free-fall bomb drop in 1952. And that was 500 kilotons. So when you think about modern technology now, we've miniaturized things and what have you, there's every reason to suspect that, yep, he's probably got a hydrogen bomb here with his 124 kilotons. So the next issue is, has he got all this all ready to go on, ICBMs, missiles, that kind of thing? And so that's the next worry, you might say, because he's doing all these tests, this guy Kim, and you must admit you wondered about some of the translations in the press, because it comes across like a joke cartoon character,
Right.
You wonder whether something's lost in translation when you hear these headlines. We will have a super massive mighty strike against you, and you know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's just,
it is. It's very cartoonish. I agree.
it makes him look like a Looney Tune character.
But yeah, at the same time, I mean, he does have some power with this.
Yeah, well, this is it. But so conventional nuclear weapons, then, aside, if I might use that term, here's the other interesting thing about some more exotic weapon systems. I said to you that there are countries out there, and Soviet Russia, Russia going back to a few decades now, they too obviously were developing nuclear weapons, but they appear to be going down a certain route, and I'm really drawing heavily now upon the work of one Thomas Bearden, who used to be in the US Army, retired, I think, lieutenant colonel. And he's wrote many, many big, thick tomes regarding, advanced technology and, free energy in inverted commas, that kind of thing. Very, very science-based, though. He cites research papers and the whole works, So he's looking at these things, and he's talking a lot about the Soviet weapons programs, and he's looking at some of the on-the-record articles, which we have, and I'll give you an example. So, obviously, the Soviet Union, like in the 80s or whatever, they do a lot of their tests, some of them out to sea. So, there are instances where we've got commercial airlines, passengers all there looking out the windows, pilot looking out the windows, and they are giving some amazing reports of very strange things that they see, glowing lights and God knows what. And some of them are mushroom clouds, like from nuclear tests. And there was one particular instance where a pilot was a civilian pilot, but he used to be in the military. And so he sees this mushroom cloud appear, over past, side of his plane or whatever, and he thinks there's going to be a massive shockwave, so he's like banking the plane, thinking this is really bad, and nothing happens at all. And he was very surprised by that. And then they started to realize, and this is what Bearden starts talking about, when it comes to nuclear explosions, when we think of an explosion, it's exceptionally hot, and obviously it goes outwards. Explosion, hence the term. Right. But what the Soviet Union started to do was start to look at more exotic types of nuclear weapons, which formed mushroom clouds to look at, but they were actually implosions. They were they were forming like a centripetally, not centrifugally. Centrifugal going outwards. They were going like centripetally. They were forming internally. And these explosions were actually cold explosions. They were not hot explosions. So they were looking at things like this. Now, when you, again, and I draw attention to what I just mentioned previously, when they're doing these kinds of tests, though, they want to set them up and trigger their tests such that there are special ratio connections between, such as where the device is and, say, the sun. So they do these kinds of things. Well, when Bearden was talking about the Soviets, he said, they not only, following World War II, were in a race to also get the bomb and develop nuclear weapons in that sense, but they were also looking into other breakthrough technologies for military purposes. And so Bearden goes on in his book to talk about what we might call exotic beam weapons. And in this instance, it refers to a weapon system known as a scalar interferometer. This is a very interesting system. We're all, I suppose, familiar with light under what we call the electromagnetic spectrum. Yeah, this is where you've got a light beam, and it's got two components, an electric component oscillating at 90 degrees to a magnetic component, and there's one is like strengthening, the other one's weakening, and in standard light wave, visible lights of the electromagnetic spectrum, and you can go to really intense cosmic rays, high frequency, or you can have very long, like radio waves, where the wavelengths are very long. So that kind of thing, yeah. Now, what is a scalar beam then? Well, this is one of the things, and Bearden cites and critical research papers from people like Whittaker. I believe this one goes back to 1904. And how do you generate a scalar wave? Well, what he found was this. If you have one electromagnetic beam, and you've got like a device, it's like a laser, you fire it out, no problem, you can see that the beam's there. Such a beam, if it comes into contact with matter, say, matter blocks it. Just generally anything there, the beam will hit it, they'll be blocked by it, just like a little laser light beam or whatever that you might have, yeah? You don't really penetrate matter much with this beam. You can think about having such a beam as a really high intensity beam, like a burning laser, sure, but even that takes time to cut through matter. But you've got a standard electromagnetic beam like that. Well, here's what being notes about some of the scientists and the research. If you take two beams, same frequency and amplitude, say, and you combine them, if you were to combine them in phase, matching peak to peak and trough to trough of the electric and magnetic components, you basically get still an electromagnetic beam, but more intense, okay, a higher amplitude, yeah? But if you merge these two electromagnetic beams 180 degrees out of phase, cancelling the components seemingly, well, if you merge them in, some device and then out comes, from the nozzle bit, you're thinking, hey, where's the beam coming out here? Well, if you merge them in phase, you get this higher electromagnetic, higher intensity electromagnetic beam. If you merge them out of phase, what's coming out of your device? Well, the answer, a lot of physicists will look at that and say mathematically, because we've cancelled it, nothing's coming out of the device. Well, that's not true. What is coming out of the device now is a scalar beam. But if you have like equipment set up to detect like electric and magnetic fields, say, you'll not detect this beam because you've enfolded these two components. And this is the critical thing. You have not cancelled them so that they cease to exist. You've enfolded them. And the reason why we know this is as follows. Because if you have one scalar beam, like so, where you've got two electromagnetic beams merged in some device, and out pops the scalar beam, and you're thinking there's nothing there. Well, if at a distance, some distance away, you have another scalar beam generated, and you interfere both beams at a distance, right, at a third point. When the two beams cross over, what happens is you unlock the electromagnetic effects. They re-emerge at a distance. And the thing about these beams when they're in a scalar beam form is that they become superluminal. That is, they travel far faster than the speed of light. And two, they can penetrate through matter with practically little interference. So in this instance then, what you could do is weaponize this system as follows. Let's say, and this is what they set up in Soviet Russia, you've got one transmitting station at one location. You could have another one a couple of 100 miles away. And let's say you've got some target thousands of miles away in another country, say. What you do is you get one beam, you develop it, you create the scalar beam from one of these sites, and you shoot it right through the Earth. And it goes straight through the Earth, like no interaction practically, very little. It goes straight through, almost as if it's not there. You do the same thing at the second site, and you very carefully calibrate the beams so they interfere with one another at a distance. They punch through the Earth and come up through the Earth at the other side of the planet, say, at a target site, and you unlock the electromagnetic effects, and you can create, in this instance, some very unusual phenomena. You could create, for example, you could create glowing balls of light of expanding power in the way in which you interfere these beams. And one of the things, these can be very destructive as well, by the way, but the other thing is this, and going back to some of these reports of exotic things sighted off the sea, off Russia, especially in the 80s, what they found was some of these observations showed nuclear mushroom clouds, and then right sat on top of them, massive glowing spheres. And in one case, Bearden actually gave a scaling image of one sphere about 380 miles in diameter, a massive glowing sphere about that big, seemingly sat on top of a nuclear mushroom cloud. Wow. Now, the reason I mention this is because I've already stated that when they trigger nuclear weapons, they do it so that the sun's in a certain location relative to the ground zero and the certain special arc lengths. Well, this, as I said, boosts the nuclear yield. So by seeing these things here with these expanding spheres with this scalar beam weapons system, what they are also experimenting in is boosting the energy from the energy that they would literally feed into the laser beams, the scalar beams themselves. They tap into celestial forces to boost it many, many times greater, just like with nuclear weapons. They're tapping into celestial forces.
Right.
Now, where this gets really interesting is when you think about, let's say you didn't want to cause an interference between two beams somewhere in the sky, say, to create a massive explosion of light or whatever. Let's say you wanted to create an interference zone deep within the Earth, a few dozen or maybe a couple of 100 miles deep. Well, if you do that and you interfere them at the right time, the right instance in time, at the right location relative to the Earth, you can use this weapon system to trigger earthquakes. And this is one of the more subtle ways in which countries can attack one another.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we bring this whole thing back to North Korea, because we have seen a few very interesting articles that have occurred or been in the press. And these are like mainstream newspapers here. And one of them is, let me see now. One of them is these are from the Daily Mail, right? The Daily Mail Online. It's a major British newspaper, and we had an article which came out, and this one goes back a few years. This one, the 1st of April. And I know this is the actual article came out the 1st of April 2014, and it was talking about an event that took place just. Let me see now. I've got the images on screen here. It was actually the 31st. It was the day before, 31st of March 2014. There was an earthquake just off the Korean peninsula out to sea. And it's a 5.0 earthquake, pretty, rare, unusual for one to, they don't happen that frequently in that part of the ocean. Yeah, it's just off the Korean peninsula. Mm-hmm. So this article comes out in the Daily Mail the next day, 1st of April, and it's saying earthquake off coast of North Korea sparks fears that Kim Jong-un has carried out his threat to hold nuclear tests. Now, this is a bit strange because the earthquake, was to really, as a depth wise, the depth of this particular earthquake, I've got this right, 17.9 kilometers. I think that's about 11 miles or something like that. Mm-hmm. But again, it's underneath the ocean as well. Nobody's burrowed down there. So if this is a nuclear test, it's not a nuclear device, okay? It's not a nuclear device. So I did a bit of an analysis of this event, and I looked at some of the ratios, the arc length ratios, comparing it to known nuclear events. And this is one of the things that you can find. You can find real correspondences between them. You can show that a certain nuclear event, like a compared King and Bravo, and you find like there's this 8/3 ratio. You can do the same thing here, and this is what I did. So I found out that some of the ratios associated with this North Korean event matched up no nuclear tests. So this made me think, yes, this is definitely an artificial event. Mm-hmm. But based upon that article, though, coming out when it did, it makes me think this is a scalar beam weapon system that North Korea's developed and they're testing. And this article, the actual article, even says this. When it talks about it, let me see. There's like a critical reference here. This is what it says, that I quote here from the article. It comes just 2 days after the saber-rattling state threatened to launch a, quote, new form of nuclear power tests. New form. That's exactly what they say in this article from 2014. Now, here's another interesting tidbit of information. The actual time, the universal time of day for when this device was set off, right, was 19 hours, 48 minutes, and 36 seconds. This is in 2014. So, here we have another article suddenly come out of nowhere, and this one was more recent. This one here, then, if I've got the article in front of me, this was another article discussing the same kind of thing. And this one, magnitude 6 earthquake hits off the coast of North Korea, sparking fears Kim Jong-un has detonated another nuclear bomb, before experts insist it was a genuine quake. That's the exact title of the article. And this one, again, same major newspaper, 12th of July 2017. So this was just a couple of months ago. The first one was in March 2014. This one, about 3 years later or so, just a couple of months ago. This time it's a 6.0 earthquake. And the depth, 348 miles. Wow. Now, again, nowhere is there an actual device being burrowed under the sea floor. But again, so this article just comes out of nowhere, hits the front pages, and then like disappears. And again, it's implying, wait a minute, we've got something going off here. But again, all the experts immediately insist it's fake. But why would that article even occur? Yeah. So we've got this article here then. And I want to just draw your attention to something, because, again, anybody can check this. This is unbelievable, this first connection. You know how I said the 2014 event, the time of day that it went off was 19 hours, 48 minutes. Okay, that was the 5.0 earthquake. Well, this one that went off, which developed a 6.0 signature one in July of this year, the time of day when that one went off was 19 hours, 48 minutes. It's like the same number of hours, same number of minutes, like 19 hours for both of them, like that. And in terms of seconds, it was also 7 seconds. So it's like something like 28 seconds, literally time difference for universal time of day for these two things. So you're thinking, what? No way is that coincidence. No way is that coincidence. So this is what we've got to realize here. What had happened was this. Just going back to some of the major news stories, round about April, there was a hell of a lot of pressure being put on North Korea. And a lot of people were saying things like, hey, we don't want them to develop higher powered devices, nuclear devices, because the last one that they developed was the 11.6 kiloton one, yeah? And Hiroshima, as I said, was 15. So they'd only done 5 tests at their main test site. So that a lot of pressure was put on North Korea to say, do not, incite things, don't make things worse, don't do another test, because he's bragging his ass off, this Kim, about we've got hydrogen bombs, we've got supermassive devices, we will annihilate the great Satan and all that, you know.
Yeah.
all that stuff. So he's trying to brag his ass off about these things. And it looks like a lot of pressure's been put to bear on him. Don't do a test. And so what we have then, he doesn't do a test in May or June or whatever, but in July, we have this very interesting seismic signature. And again, it's comparable to a nuclear type, yield. So I thought to myself, I know that those time differences, both of them 19 hours, 48 minutes, significant. But I did a very careful evaluation of the site where the coordinates of this July earthquake event. And again, I believe that they used a scalar beam system to cause an interference zone deep under the earth. And again, I've done the analysis of it. So the arc length, the ratios associated with it, they're very much a kind of nuclear signature. So they've got their boosting effect going on. So this was an artificially engineered earthquake. I looked very carefully at the coordinates of it. And again, it's just off the coast of North Korea to the east. And the precise coordinates, again, because it's a seismic event, it's listed as an earthquake on the USGS. So we've got the location is 40.855 north, 131.664 east for the July event. And here is where you look at how a person can, shall we say, send a message to another country. So let's say North Korea were attacked. What would its response be? Well, where they actually set off this earthquake reveals their response, because it turns out that if you take the elliptical arc length from that seismic signature, the coordinates as I've given, direct to the equator of the Earth, and then you double that arc length, you've got a distance measure of about 5,625 miles.
Okay, and hold that thought, Keith. We're heading for a break very quickly here. This is so exciting. Everybody, please stay tuned to listen to Ravenstar's Witching Hour. I am your host, Solaris BlueRaven. My incredible guest tonight is Keith Hunter. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.